Welcome to this Cambridge A-Level History presentation, which guides students through answering Paper 3 questions, specifically focusing on a question from a past paper to provide context. The question I've used is from February-March 2023, and it states, "What can you learn from this extract about the interpretation and approach of the historian who wrote it? Use the extract and your knowledge of the Cold War to explain your answer." And it's for 40 marks. The wording of this question is always the same. You are given an extract and you need to decide whether it falls into the traditional / orthodox, revisionist, or post-revisionist views of who was to blame for the Cold War. And very importantly, you need to be able to justify your argument. This you'll need to do both from analyzing the extract and using your knowledge of the Cold War period prior to 1950. There are three interpretations and approaches that you need to be aware of. Firstly, the traditional or orthodox view. This is where the Soviet Union and Stalin's expansionist policies are blamed for the Cold War. Then, in the 1960s and 70s, some historians began to espouse a different approach. This was the revisionist view, which focused more on the United States, particularly highlighting its alleged goal of economic dominance over Europe. And then came the post-revisionist view, which you can think of as like the swing of a pendulum going from the extremes and settling back to the middle. This was a more balanced approach that attributes responsibility to both the US and the Soviet Union in escalating the Cold War. Your first step in answering this question is to read the extract through completely. Don't be tempted to analyze it bit by bit before you do this. As you read, try to get a sense of whether the author's view is traditional, revisionist, or post-revisionist. Once you've read the extract through, then you can begin to analyze the text bit by bit, making notes. Remember that the question asks you to analyze which approach the extract falls into. It can be very tempting to go beyond this brief and also focus on the validity of the writer's approach. With the question that we're looking at in this presentation, that is particularly so because you'll see that the extract's not good from a historiography point of view, with the author repeatedly making statements which are not backed up with evidence. As I answer the question, if I have time, I might throw in that point. Probably won't get me any marks, given the scope of the question. Before you hand in your paper, make sure that you put a line through your notes and label them something like "Notes, not for marking." Now to the extract. Let's read it through.
A close-up view of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin is critical to understanding how they interacted to create and sustain Allied unity. Similarly, investigating the inequalities of Truman, Kennan, and Harriman, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, helps in realizing why they opposed the compromises and ambiguity that were essential in sustaining the Grand Alliance. The concept of emotional belief is useful in explaining how each of these six figures made the leap away from logic, from what they knew to what they wanted to believe. Emotional beliefs entail arranging the evidence to support a conclusion that goes beyond the evidence. Roosevelt's personal background predisposed him to an emotional belief that post-war cooperation was necessary and worth the risk. He held enormous belief in America's power and future, and in himself as a man of destiny. But he would die before he could make use of his two greatest advantages: control over the atom bomb and post-war economic aid. Churchill's background, very different from Roosevelt's, gave the British leader an emotional belief that the interests he cared about would be better served by an alliance with Washington against Moscow. The most significant emotional belief of Truman's first year as president developed out of his unquestioning faith in American exceptionalism. He believed the atomic bomb was born out of the country's unique engineering and scientific talent, industrial workmanship, and American know-how. This was a combination the Russians could not match, concluded the president. His thinking ignored the explicit advice of atomic scientists and a majority of his own cabinet. He also ignored those voices in deciding that the safest bet was not in a possible Big Three deal with the Kremlin, but rather in staying ahead in an atomic arms race. Not knowing much about foreign affairs and prone to hasty emotional judgments, Truman as president proved susceptible to manipulation. Harriman and others exploited his insecurities and his impulse to play the tough guy with Stalin and other rivals. Harriman's emotional belief, which he pressed on Truman with success and ultimately dire consequences, was that Stalin would back down if pressed hard. Though the dictator gave in on some matters, on most he pushed back even harder. The shoving match would develop into the Cold War. In 1946 to 1947, Kennan was determined to shake the United States out of what he saw as dangerous complacency and struggled hard to create an emotional belief about the Soviet challenge. He went beyond the evidence of Moscow's behavior and ambition, and indeed distorted the picture so as to depict the Kremlin as a monstrous threat to the United States and to democracy itself. He warned that the Soviets, while not planning war, aimed in every other way to penetrate and disrupt a US-led international order. When based in Moscow, nothing about the Kremlin's repression had frustrated Kennan more than the isolation of foreigners from Soviet citizens. Being deprived of contact with Russians led him to conclude that the Soviet government should likewise be contained and isolated. In 1946 to 47, Kennan helped reframe the issue from whether the United States and the Soviet Union should reach a practical compromise to whether it was realistic and justifiable to negotiate with a regime driven by what he saw as an abhorrent ideology. Ideology reduced the complex global crisis to easily understandable slogans and images, to a contest of good versus evil. Roosevelt had nearly always downplayed ideology, yet Kennan found in Truman a more receptive audience.
Now let's analyze the text from the point of view of the question. He states that Truman, Kennan, and Harriman were opposed to compromising in their dealings with the uncertain relations between the USA and USSR, and this strongly intimates that he believed they were uncooperative. That would fit in with a revisionist point of view. And then using the term leap away from logic is an emotive statement indicating the author's view that these men made decisions based on their emotional beliefs rather than on logic. The text also continues with the assertion that all six figures made up their minds about what they wanted to believe and then twisted the facts to support their opinions, rather than going with what they knew. Again, Stalin, Churchill, and the American leaders all come in for criticism. If the author's argument continued in that vein, we might be looking at a post-revisionist approach. But let's see. Then we have an explanation that emotional beliefs involve organizing evidence to reach a conclusion that exceeds the available proof. Concerning Roosevelt, the author intimates that he was a strong character who believed that America was powerful enough to engage in cooperation with the USSR without danger to its own interests. However, he too had an emotional belief based on his background. But Roosevelt died. The brief reference to Churchill asserts that he had an emotional belief that it would be better for Britain to remain close to the US and its policies. I think that's a fairly neutral statement. Then the author claims that Truman had an emotional belief that the USA was superior to Russia, evidenced by the invention of the atomic bomb, which convinced him that American talent and knowledge was better than what the Russians had, and that Stalin wouldn't be able to match the Americans' advanced military technology. That's basically saying that Truman was arrogant. And then accusing Truman of ignoring the explicit advice of experts is definitely critical of him. The author also states that Truman believed that staying ahead of the USSR in a nuclear arms race was better than negotiation. This statement criticizes Truman for both ignoring expert advice and for adopting a militarily aggressive attitude in preference to negotiation. And that's a revisionist view. Here again, prone to hasty emotional judgments is a statement that is critical of Truman, as is stating that he was impulsive and then susceptible to manipulation. Harriman and others are also shown in a bad light, being accused of exploiting Truman's alleged insecurities to achieve their aims. This is definitely a revisionist approach, casting blame on various American leaders for not only manipulating their president, but because their actions would have, quote, dire consequences, unquote. The statement that Stalin would back down if pressed hard, and the following two sentences, suggest U.S. aggression in the first instance, which is a revisionist view, with the USSR adopting an aggressive response. The fact that Stalin is derisively referred to as the dictator can be seen as a criticism of who he was. But we need to keep looking at how balanced or imbalanced the author's views are. The word create used here, and the accusation that Kennan went beyond the evidence of Moscow's behavior and ambition, distorting the picture, is a serious criticism of this important American diplomat. And in fact, we know from our background studies that Kennan was the architect of the American containment policy towards the USSR. These sentences continue to frame Kennan in a very anti-Soviet light, and we know that the so-called long telegram that he sent claimed that the USSR was expansionist due to its ideological hostility towards the West. These sentences continue to frame Kennan in a very anti-Soviet light, and we know that the so-called long telegram that he sent, claiming that the USSR was expansionist due to its ideological hostility towards the West, had a powerful influence. And, not for the first time in this extract, Truman is criticized for being easily influenced. Let's look at what the Cambridge mark scheme for this question states. I'll read it. The main interpretation is that all actors in the Cold War were motivated by emotional beliefs rather than logic, but those held by Truman and the U.S. policy-making elite were particularly harmful. The interpretation stresses the importance of American emotional beliefs in shaping the Cold War. In the way in which it focuses on the anti-Soviet beliefs of key U.S. figures, and especially of Truman, it places blame on the United States for initiating the shift from wartime cooperation to Cold War confrontation. Truman is seen as hasty and ill-informed, open to manipulation by advisors who shared his beliefs. No label other than revisionist can be acceptable at levels 5 and 6. Arguments that the US is to blame, but no engagement with the idea of emotional beliefs, will be level 3 only. And if you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation on which this video is based, as well as a model answer to this question, please email me at interflint@gmail.com, putting Paper 3, March 2023 in the subject line. There's no charge for this. I hope you found that useful. Thank you for watching.